So we develop a plan. We need to know how we can actually go through and analyze our code and do things. The plan is really around the code profiling tools, which I'll talk about a little bit later on in the conversation about how we go about doing it. But one of the other things that we can do in terms of a proactive approach is taking a look at our code at compile time before we've done anything with it, using various static code analysis tools. Microsoft, through the Patterns and Practices team, has published a list of standards and best practices around performance. Certain things that you might do in your application that would adversely impact the performance of your application in the future. Some of those rules that you might see in there, there are some static code analysis items that would catch using resources that implement a high disposable where you don't actually clean them up. So things where if you have an exception, you end up leaving resource references out there, things of that nature. All of those can be caught with static code analysis tools. So regardless of what you're doing, you can take a look at your code in mass and see if there's anything in there that, although maybe a minor item, isn't something you can quickly change. So we'll talk through a little bit of that here. I'm going to talk through a bunch of different tools. I'll get into that here in just a minute. From a code analysis perspective, are any of you not using Visual Studio 2010? Okay. So one of the things that you would get in prior to Visual Studio 2010, Microsoft had a tool called FxCop, which was a standalone static code analysis tool. With Visual Studio 2010, FxCop became baked into Visual Studio 2010 as part of the Analyze functionality that you get.
Not professional, though.
What?
Not professional edition.
Is it not in professional?
It's not in professional. Yeah, it's in the premium edition.
Okay. So the good news is, even if you're not in professional, if you're in professional or standard, you can still use FxCop. It is still a standalone download available.
It's not standalone. It's part of the SDK.
Is it this?
You can still download for free. You just have to install the SDK.
The whole SDK? When did they change that?
Extract the MSI from the SDK, but it's not standalone anymore. They need to stick up the 1.37.
Oh, I think I was using one. I think I was using one just before that.
1.37 automatically. And they changed the installations.
Interesting. Okay. I can dig up. I might have to actually dig up a link and make a blog post with it because I was not aware that they changed that. So in the end, you have two environments that do the same thing. FxCop as an application outside of Visual Studio, and Visual Studio 2010's code analysis that does it all within inside of Visual Studio. In the end, they do the exact same thing. FxCop's not quite as robust in terms of the other functionality that it gives you to manage things. Visual Studio gives you a couple extra bells and whistles, and I'll talk through a couple different things. Biggest thing is you can get this functionality for free. It's just not quite as robust if you're not using the higher editions of Visual Studio. So with FxCop, the best practices rules that come with it are grouped into a bunch of different areas. You have design rules, you have globalization rules. If you have applications that you need to localize for other languages, this will catch a lot of those cases where you might have something that isn't localized. Interoperability is for anything you might be exposing via COM or other things. A lot of the rules and things apply to that. Mobility, naming, it will check the naming standards that you're using for both methods, variables, etc., all the way across the solution, namespaces, etc. So if you're not following the naming standards, if you're using acronyms and not doing the right casing, it's going to generate errors for you. You're going to be able to keep track of those types of things. There's a bunch of performance-related items in there as well, unused variables, non-disposed items, etc., all are tracked in there, and some security-related items as well. With FxCop, typically, you're running against a full rule set. You can create custom rule sets and everything with the standalone. But in the end, you take FxCop, you point it at an assembly, and it's going to give you a list of results. This is a screenshot from one of the older versions of FxCop. I think the newer versions have a slightly different IDE. But in the end, you get a fairly consistent display. You get some detail around, what kind of issue is it? The category to give you is breaking, non-breaking. So the nice thing is it tells you right away, based on the rules that are applied, to change that item, are you going to be introducing a breaking change to your application? So you can immediately identify the level of effort in a way of making that change. You also get a certainty as to how certain is it that that's actually an issue. Some items where it's not getting quite as good of a match on the rules, you'll see lower likelihood. Those are the items you may just need to discard because they're not actually an issue. You get some rule information that tells you, what was the rule that was violated. And then in the end, you get the actual item. What was it that caused that rule to be invoked? As you can see here, some of these items may not necessarily matter depending on what you're doing, but things like, naming changes, long acronyms should be Pascal cased, identifiers should be spelled correctly. There is spell check functionality built in there as well. So it has a bunch of known words. Depending on where you work, what you're doing, that can actually cause some false results in here if you don't tweak things a little bit. I used to work for Wells Fargo Home Mortgage a while back, and our namespaces always started out with WFHM, all caps. That is a violation of naming standards. Running FxCop against an assembly that had that naming standard for namespaces resulted in around 3,000 invalid messages from FxCop. So you will sometimes need to tweak things a little bit, especially if you violate any of the standard naming conventions and you're trying to run the static code analysis against it. As you go through, in addition to just telling you the one quick line item as to what's going on, why it thinks there's a problem with your code, you can click on any one of them and get the detailed rule information. Looks something like this. And in the end, if you look at it, it tells you where the problem was, gives you a link out to MSDN documentation for full detail as to why they put the rule in, what the impact is of the rule. And then you also get some additional info. And then the other thing is you get the resolution on most of them. And what it does is it tells you in no uncertain terms exactly what you need to change in your code. So if it makes a recommendation on changing return types, it's going to show you exactly this code needs to become this code. Makes it really easy for you to go through and follow things. With FxCop working on a standalone basis, it tells you the file. You can quickly go find the file, make the change yourself, and be up to date pretty quickly. Biggest thing is, as I mentioned, not all of the rules are going to apply. Within FxCop itself, you can skip a rule. You can skip all occurrences of a rule, and you can then save those items off so that you know which ones were skipped, which ones were saved. You can also take care of creating a custom dictionary. The folder path may have actually changed from what I have listed here, but a custom dictionary is simply an XML file that you put in any of the individual words that you want to do. Or if you have a word that if somebody uses it, they really should be using something else, you can control all of that for the rule analysis within these config files in the FxCop directory. Now, FxCop works great, but why was there that change? Why does Visual Studio have something that's in some editions of Visual Studio and not others? Because in the end, in Visual Studio 2010, if you have the right edition, you get the ability to run code analysis and have the results appear something like this. If you run code analysis from within Visual Studio, everything shows up in the error list. And you get the same bits and pieces of information that you get from the standalone FxCop, but there's a number of additional features that make your life a lot easier. First of all, since it's in the error list in Visual Studio, you double-click on any one of those errors, not only does it know where it is, it takes you to that exact line in that exact code file so you can make the change right away. Because everything is tied and linked to your source. The other thing that you can do is it has the concept of a project or individual file suppression list. So if you have a specific project where you don't want to run any specific rule against it, you can simply right-click on that rule and you're given two options. suppress as a comment or suppress in global suppressions. And what it does is it allows you to choose how to suppress it. Next time you run code analysis, you will never see that error message again because you've suppressed it from the results. It's in files that stay with that project. So if you go and transfer that off to another developer, if you come back to that project in 6 months, all of that information is there. With FxCop, each analysis run has its own set of excludes. So the extra stuff that Visual Studio gives you around it makes it a lot easier. Also, say for example, you're working in an organization where globalization isn't of importance to you. So you want to run all of the rules in the best practices library except the rules around globalization. You can modify a rule set, save that as an asset within your solution, and then as each developer would open that solution, it's going to know to use that rule set, which would ignore any of those globalization rules. So you get the same function, the same base functionality, just with a lot of bells and whistles wrapped around it. And I think with VS11, there's going to be even more changes around some of this and how it works. From a standards process and from a best practices perspective, one of the things that you can do with the Visual Studio integration is you can set on a project basis to tell it to run code analysis with every build. Smaller projects, not necessarily a big deal. Larger projects, the analysis process gets to be time consuming. So you may not want to do it, but you could enforce that this analysis is done at the end of every or you can do it ad hoc. And you can run it on a project by project or on a solution basis, depending on what you're wanting to look at. This is one of the tools that I think is continuing to evolve. It's one of the good ones that Microsoft took. One of their existing products that was standalone, pulled it into Visual Studio just to make everything easier, but they left it so you can still get access to the core functionality, even if you don't have the appropriate addition in Visual Studio.